when you and I got online and were just talking about personal finance and getting to know each other, when you walked through what it's like to move to Europe and work in the different tech hubs, I thought to myself, this is something that tech employees in the United States would love to learn about. Why don't you sort of walk me through that overview and let's have a conversation about that.
Tech in Europe is a very interesting scene, and it kind of gets lost, let's say, in the headlines because the US is obviously where a lot of the innovation and a lot of these companies are founded, and then there's a lot of interest in the Far East and emerging markets, but Europe, I think, has a lot to offer.
I really do too. And the thing is, at one point, my wife and I looked at taking an opportunity to go work in Norway for a multimedia company to be their chief information officer. But as we got over there, and for us, as we spent time over there, and even myself working for different companies, I know that, London is a big hub. Dublin is a big hub. I know Switzerland has a big hub as well. Paris is coming online with, a lot of this artificial intelligence, AI. But what is it like over there, I think, for yourself? When you first moved to Europe, I know you landed in Dublin. What's sort of the Dublin environment like versus London versus where you are in Switzerland?
I'm relatively new to Zurich. It's only been a year and a half, but I think Dublin is a great city to aim for, especially if you're an early career professional looking to get into tech or you're a fresh graduate, because a lot of the tech companies will have their Europe, Middle East, and Africa headquarters in Dublin. So you have a lot of job opportunities for entry level or like 1 to 4 year professionals, and you get exposed to a lot more diversity than maybe you would in any other place, I would say, in the world, but that might be a bit of an exaggeration. But you're walking in one building and you're going up the floors, and one floor is like German speakers, Italians, French, Arabic, Africa, Russia, Turkey. So you have this amazing mix of different people in a very small, geographic location. And it has a bit of a college campus kind of vibe, right? Because everyone is in that 22 to 26, 27 age range. So it's a very good place to aim for if you're just getting started. If you like Dublin, if you end up liking the culture there, and a lot of people do, you can have a great career. Because all of the big tech companies are there. All of them have these big offices. But I think the one main disadvantage is that a lot of people, after a couple of years, decide either to move on to the US or move back home or move to, a bigger city. So the downside would be that every few years you have to kind of refresh your friend circle. So that's probably one of the, I would say, the downsides of Dublin. London, I haven't lived there. I only recently visited for the first time, but it's a similar situation, right? So it's also all the big tech companies have their presence there. In general, the profile is for people who are a bit more senior. So with already 3 or 4 years of experience, and a lot more senior leadership from what I've seen is based in London. So it's another really great place to end up in. I wouldn't be able to speak to what it's like to live there, but I have a lot of friends who moved and they absolutely love it. Zurich, on the other hand, is a bit different because you don't have a lot of the gigantic offices. Google would be an exception where there's a fairly big product and engineering hub. But Switzerland has a lot to offer in terms of startups. It has a lot of strong local companies as well. And they're doing a lot to kind of encourage innovation. I think like Zug, which is a small town close to here, is known as like the crypto valley of Europe. So it also has a lot to offer. But primarily for us, it was about the quality of life that you get here, proximity to nature and that kind of stuff.
Going back, it sounds like Dublin, right? Especially when you're looking for those transition years. I think most of us, myself, right out of college, I was excited to move to San Francisco, to be in a city environment where on the weekend you're getting the chance to mingle with people that are working for all these other exciting companies. It sounds like Dublin really gives you that environment as well. Did you mention when we had that conversation before, did you say is that the housing pretty compressed in Dublin? Is it hard to find housing there?
Yes, it seems like a trend across all major cities around the world, but Dublin is a pretty extreme case there. I saw like a ranking of least affordable cities, and Dublin was somewhere close to the top, and a big part of that is housing. Primarily, It's because everyone wants to live within walking distance of their jobs. So everyone wants to be in this one specific area. And public transport isn't as great an option as it is, for example, in Zurich. In Zurich, it's very common to live, let's say, an hour outside because you can hop on a train and work on the train and you're in the city. You might also get tax benefits from living outside of the city, but in Dublin, there aren't that kind of benefits. So that's one of the situations that you end up in. And housing is pretty extreme. I think when I first moved there, you would pay 30% of your income on rent, which isn't terrible if you were sharing. By the time we left, I know people who were paying like 40, 50% for rent. And you're talking about people who are relatively high earners, right? So it's a tough situation to manage.
Yeah, it takes a lot out. But then it sounds like, though, when you transition to somewhere like Zurich, that area, that was part of your personal transition when you said, okay, we're now spreading out. We want a little bit more space. We want to live outside the city. And that it's a hub like that affords you that opportunity.
It is definitely an option. Interestingly, that was part of the discussion before we moved to Zurich. And then we elected to live like right in the middle of the city because we got a pretty good deal. But primarily moving to Switzerland it is one of the most expensive cities in the world, Zurich, but it's one of the more affordable places that I've actually lived just because the salaries versus the price makes sense. I think for example, my wife and I find Zurich much more affordable than Dublin. It's more expensive, but it's more affordable, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, so let's double click into that because what I'm hearing you say is that, because most large technology companies are going to have a salary per city that has to do with the cost of living. So what I'm hearing you say is you live in Zurich, you're then going to get a big tech salary that's equivalent to the cost of living there, which then nets out to make it affordable versus it sounds like, because I know Dublin, I know Cork, some of those areas were viewed from the United States as, low cost of living areas. So it sounds like the salaries haven't caught up with what's happening with the housing prices.
Yeah, housing is primarily the driver of the costs. It's just compared to 2015 and now I think they've gone up 50, 60%.
And so how did you break into working in Europe?
By complete coincidence, to be honest. I was interning in Paris, in HSBC at the time, so nothing to do with tech. And I get this email from my university that Google is organizing an event for Arabic speakers in Paris, in their Paris office. So okay, that sounds cool. The only thing I knew about Google is that they have these really cool offices, with slides and free food and stuff. So,
right.
I applied and they invited us over. And I was surprised that they actually need people who are not engineers, who are not technical, because I couldn't figure out why they would want a business graduate. And then after that, there weren't actually any vacancies to apply to. So I left Paris a few weeks after that. I moved to Dubai, but it kind of stuck with me. And I remember kind of researching how AdWords works. And I thought, okay, I can do that. I guess I can work in sales. And I just applied for a role for an Arabic speaker in the small and medium business sales team. That's how it started. I'd love to say I knew that tech was going to really take off in the next 10 years and that's the horse I'm betting on. But that was it. It seemed pretty cool and I'm here 9 years later, so pretty happy.
As an entry-level, European employee, did you get equity? Did you get RSUs?
Yeah. So you do. Yeah, that was part of the package. That was a very pleasant surprise, especially when, you first getting started in a company and you get this third line item, right? So there's your salary, there's your bonus, and then there's equity that vests over X amount of years. You're like, well, so now I have a vested interest in staying in this company over the long term.
Yes.
And there's these new factors that start to play into your mind where, let's say, another company reaches out and they're like, oh, we'll give you 20% extra, but then you know that there's a stock that's going to vest and you believe in that stock long term, then equity starts to become a very important part of the conversation. One thing that I was disappointed to find out is that in Ireland, when your RSUs actually vest, they're taxed at 52%, right?
Whoa.
So, yeah, I know. So 52% of the stocks that vested during my time in Ireland were sold on vesting, and they go off to pay off your taxes. So that's something to keep in mind, right? If you're moving from, I don't know, a country with more favorable tax benefits.
Sure. Yeah, like the United States. I know the United States, you're going to have, you have federal rates. You also have some state tax rates. You live somewhere like Texas and Florida, no income tax. It's actually works out relatively well. So, and again, I know that you're not compensation expert, but I also know that you're a financially savvy guy. Do you know, are there countries that are more favorable to RSUs and stocks than Ireland, let's say?
Yeah, so the region that I'm most familiar with would be Europe, Middle East, Africa. The most favorable would be somewhere like Dubai, just because there's no taxes, right? So there's no income tax, there's no tax on capital gains, there's no taxes on vesting. So that would be number one. Europe, I would say, Switzerland is pretty favorable, but Switzerland is similar to the US, that each canton, which would be the equivalent of a state, has its own regulations and rules when it comes to taxes. But Switzerland doesn't have any capital gains. They have a wealth tax, which is relatively small. So Switzerland is would also be pretty favorable, I would say.
Do you have any insights into any of the other European countries like France or Germany or UK?
I'm pretty high, I think. I think from what I've heard from most of my American colleagues and friends, when they hear about tax rates, they're like, oh, okay, this is pretty intense. There are benefits to it, right? I think in terms of if you decide to move from the US to working in Europe, maybe you're doing it because you want a second passport. Maybe you're doing it because you want to live somewhere. It's a bit easier to visit 3 different continents. Europe is maybe where you live. Africa is a plane away. South Africa is the same time zone as Switzerland, which is not something that's intuitive to a lot of people. So you can work from Cape Town, right? You can go to the Middle East and you're 1 plane away. East Asia is relatively close. So maybe you want to experience living abroad and that's it. So, but in terms of compensation, from what I've heard and what I've seen, the US is still the best place to be, even when you factor in cost of living.
But let's land on those experiences for a moment. I think going back to what you articulated in Ireland, that's experience of, you're in an actual building where there's people from all over the world that are working there. I definitely think that San Francisco, myself having lived and worked there, it's a fascinating experience because you have a lot of people that are versed in a lot of different technology. There's definitely a foreign element, but I don't think it's as immersive. What are some of your big takeaways from having that experience?
I think that especially when you go through business school or you read about different cultures and stuff, there's these, let's say, stereotypes, right? Like, if you're dealing with this kind of person or a person from this specific region, this is how you're supposed to deal with them, that you're supposed to be less formal, more formal, there's less power distance. And my experience has been that at the core, you'll get by just fine by counting on the core basics, like being dependable, being honest, trying to understand where the other person is coming from, what are their needs, what are they trying to accomplish. And then all the other stuff is very, very secondary. So I think that was my learning.
People at their core. I know for myself, I had the opportunity with Accenture in 2008 to go live and work in Tokyo. So I lived and worked in Japan and I traveled. I was running a large project in Asia Pacific that was in between Japan and China and also covered Malaysia and Singapore. And the culture was very different from a language perspective. Alphabet perspective is what I struggle with. What I enjoy about Europe is at least I know the alphabet. It's definitely much more of a challenge. But what I found is if you can express empathy, if you can really try and understand where the other person is coming from, if you can learn more about the cultural context, right? The fact that in Japan, it's more about harmony than it is about individuals. And then there's some people that in that culture want to be individuals, right? And understanding that context, you can then relate and you can then be engaged and you can then build trust. And then you can also learn to lead. That was one of the things that I discovered there was how could I craft and shape my leadership style to be accepted in the culture and then to become a leader there, which had a series of challenges, but they were also fun to overcome and to find the other side. I'm sure that for yourself, landing and working in Dublin and then now in Switzerland, and my understanding is that your scope of responsibility is other European countries and there's some travel and stuff. I'm sure that has to be a side benefit as well, too.
It is a big benefit to it, because one of the things that I kind of regret not doing when I was in Dublin is getting exposure to different markets, because I stayed there for 7 years, and it would have been nice to maybe do a couple of years of Middle East, North Africa, maybe a couple of years with the UK, maybe a couple of years with France, because I speak French, and it really rounds you out as a person. And what I like about this role is that I work with partners in the UK, partners in France, partners in Germany, partners in the Nordics, so all around Europe, and on different products. So I get to work with people in the US and people in Australia and Singapore. So I think that kind of exposure is probably one of the biggest perks, I would say, of what I'm currently doing right now. In terms of travel, I never turned down the opportunity to hop on a train and go to Paris. So I think that's one of the cool things about working in Europe, is that everything is so close.